It's time for episode 48 of The Crisis Show here on Google Hangouts and on YouTube, now seen in more than 100 countries. My name is Rich Klein. I'm president of Rich Klein Crisis Management and founder and host of The Crisis Show. Tonight, I'm so pleased to introduce a friend, a colleague. He is the author of the Media Training Bible, Brad Phillips, Mr. Media Training from New York. How are you, Brad?
I'm good. How are you, Rich?
Good, thank you. Good to see you again. It's been a while, but for our viewers' benefit, Brad is a frequent blogger, and that's an understatement. You should check him out at www.mrmediatraining.com. And we do think alike. We both have had Anthony Weiner on our mind, and that's the topic of our abbreviated episode today. As Brad and I know, being former journalists, working in the media field, we've worked with communications people, and we know that it can be a tough job sometimes, but no excuse, Brad, for what Weiner spokesperson Barbara Morgan did and what was reported on yesterday. So, Brad, what was your reaction to this tirade of expletives after she saw a story about her boss?
Well, this not only did she give a litany of X-rated terms, but they were misogynistic terms, too. They were pejorative terms referring to women. Some words that I suppose you could say on the internet, but I won't, like the one of the worst words you could use, the C word. And she was using that to respond to an accusation that a former intern for the Weiner campaign had launched. The fact is that the intern who worked for the Weiner campaign only worked for the campaign for about 4 weeks. The story that the intern told was featured in one of the New York tabloids. It wasn't especially sexy or sensational. It certainly wasn't favorable to the Weiner campaign, but as these things go, it wasn't that major. And her response was so vastly disproportionate to the challenge it faced to the campaign that she took what might be an embarrassing story that would have lasted for a few hours and really turned it into a major crisis and possibly a referendum on the entire campaign, which, when you're speaking about Anthony Weiner, is quite a statement to make.
Absolutely, yeah. And as you and I just spoke about right before we recorded the show today, we learned in a very brief video. That's so interesting, Brad. You know, there was like a 5-second clip of Anthony Weiner getting into his vehicle, and a reporter saying, "Is Barbara Morgan still with you?" He says, "You bet." And that was the clip. And that led to a story that Weiner is sticking by his communications person, which I think is a mistake, and I think you would agree that she should just. I think you wrote about this. She should just resign and move on. And
not only because it's better for the Weiner campaign, but also because it's better for her own long-term. Get out of the headlines as quickly as possible. I saw some people online today speculating that maybe Barbara Morgan was trying to say something incendiary to change the storyline, so it was no longer about Anthony Weiner and his sex, but it was about her. But I have to say that really seems like quite a bit of a stretch to me, because if anything, Barbara Morgan's response really just continues this storyline about Anthony Weiner's horrible handling of young women, the way that he both sexed people without their permission, and now with the misogynistic language that his chief spokesperson uses.
Absolutely. And this has been endemic in the campaign, of course, since he got in. You would have expected that when he made this decision, which most people would say was crazy based on his history, even though he's an intelligent guy and, a lot of people supported him on his issues. But, when he had that press conference and said, and then, announced, acknowledged that he had lied about the sexting scandal, and then getting back into the race, you have to run a very tight ship. And that means everybody on your staff has to have the highest integrity and ethics, and it seems to me, at least, Brad, just my observation, that there's an environment of loose language and views of women that are pretty disgraceful, from the top down here.
I'm very careful about name calling, but I have to say he has demonstrated through his actions that he's a chronic liar. First, in 2011, when asked, did you send these texts? And he said, no, this wasn't me. In fact, there's a story out this week that he spent tens of thousands of dollars investigating who broke into his social media accounts and hacked him, when, of course, he knew all along it was him. Then last week, we saw him in his own press conference when he said, well, I said from the very beginning of this campaign that new allegations would come out. Yes, he did say that, but he always intimated that those accusations occurred before he resigned Congress and not after. So that is certainly a lie, and he had to know he was being a bit too cute with that. And then this week, he was asked a direct question, are you still sexting with anybody? And he said, oh, beginnings, middles, ends. I forget the exact language, but he didn't answer it directly. Right. He gave this obtuse answer, very consistent with him. He seems to have a chronic problem with the truth. And, this whole thing really is, I have to say, a few people are speculating this is an Andy Kaufman experiment. How far can he push the absurdity? Or you may remember Joaquin Phoenix a few years ago took on this role of a deranged rap star. So you wonder at some degree, and I don't really believe this is the case, but it almost is coming across that way, that the level of absurdity here is going so far beyond what we're used to in a political scandal that it really has entered, I would say, the theater of the absurd, but how about well beyond the theater of the absurd?
Yeah, and it's also, there's so many angles to this, and we'll get to them in a couple of minutes. But one thing that I think for the other candidates, what I've been hearing and what you watch them is they're frustrated because all the media coverage is about this, and the issues are getting pushed to the side. So whether it's a forum or a press conference or any public appearances, these other guys and Christine Quinn, the only woman in the race, they can't get a word in. And so how do you, as a let me ask you something. If you were representing one of the other candidates, and you were facing this, this news cycle of 24/7 Anthony Weiner, even though it's negative, it's still detracting from the other candidates. How do you get your message across if you're advising another candidate? It must be very challenging for them, especially in New York City.
Well, and that's exactly what I was going to say. In the culture of New York City, where the tabloids make their living off of this, it's very hard. And especially, a lot of times you would just say, wait until Weiner's funds dry out, and at that point he'll be forced to drop out or become such an inconsequential candidate. But the fact is, he's still polling. Last I saw, 16%, fourth place. Fourth place sounds bad, and yes, he's going down. But the top candidate, Christine Quinn, is only in the 20-some percent.
Yeah.
So the difference separating them isn't vast. So this is one of those situations where it's very tough to break through, and I think the only thing really is going to be time. As it gets closer to the Democratic primary, hopefully the New York press, and by that, the New York Times and some of the more serious press is investigating the other candidates a little bit more closely, but more broadly in the New York City television climate, a lot of radio, and certainly the tabloids, it is very hard to break through in this climate.
Yeah, I think
Rich, one other thing I'd say is I read this week that the Clintons, who are very close with Huma Abedin, Anthony Weiner's wife, are using back channels to try to get him to drop out, and that certainly would help. The quicker he goes away, the quicker other people can start hopefully getting their message out. And to your main point, so where you started this question, I just want to say I've been very hard on Anthony Weiner on my social media pages, on at Mr. Media Training on Twitter. And even though a lot of it is very sarcastic and I'm making jokes at his expense, what's behind that for me is exactly what you said, a feeling that politics matters. It should be the province of serious people who are willing to negotiate and come up with solutions for people in their cities and districts that desperately need it. I think serious times call for serious people, and Anthony Weiner is about as far away from a serious person as you could find.
Yeah, and when you hear, at least from whoever you want to, whether you want to believe her or not, one of the women he was sexting, who went on the Howard Stern show, which is a whole other story, a different kind of media, of course. When someone says he's been texting her 5 or 6 times a day, you have to wonder how much he's paying attention to the issues and how much he's really interested in governing. And I think we can, when we look at all these, the guy in San Diego as well, who has this issue as well, who's refusing to resign. He's been accused of multiple sexual harassment allegations. The challenge right now for people is to get away from the Anthony Weiner story and really find out where these candidates stand on the issue. And I think it's a good opportunity to explain what off the record means, since it's in the news anyway. So tell us what on the record means to you and to journalists. I think you wrote something that if you ask 10 different journalists what off the record means, you get 10 different answers. So maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, years ago there was a survey done of 5 different reporters from the Washington Post, and they asked these 5 different reporters to identify what a few basic journalism terms meant. on the record, off the record, not for attribution, on background and on deep background. And guess what? The person doing the survey got back 5 very different responses from all 5 of those reporters. And that really underscores the problem with terms like off the record, that they have very different definitions depending on who the journalist is. There's no single standard set definition. Classically speaking, if you were to go back to the older school of journalism, off the record for most old school journalists would mean if somebody tells you a piece of information, you can tell nobody, not your spouse, not in some cases not your editor, no one. Today's school of journalism is a little bit different. A lot of people take off the record to mean I can use the information, but I'm not going to cite you by name. So the problem for spokespeople is if you go off the record, the journalist you're speaking to may define it differently than you are. But one other thing that I think is really important here, actually 2 other things. First of all, apparently Barbara Morgan said between us when she was doing this interview with the reporter from, I think it was Talking Points Memo, but didn't get the reporter's consent that it could indeed be off the record. And so, that was a real problem, that she had proceeded with giving him the off-the-record comments anyway. But the other problem is that even if you make an off-the-record agreement, if you say something so incendiary, a lot of reporters will say, yeah, I had this agreement with you, but you just said something so newsworthy, so beyond the typical agreement of what an off-the-record conversation would entail, that I'm going to break it. And even if a reporter didn't want to break it, a reporter telling his or her editor about it might find that their editor breaks the agreement for them, whether the reporter likes it or not. So she was completely ignorant of what off the record was. A political spokesperson, frankly, anybody.
I was surprised. Yeah,
should know better.
I was surprised she even tried to use it as defense. I mean, a couple of things, and thank you for that. First of all, I always tell clients, don't even go off the record, unless it's. I just can't imagine that the reward outweighs the risk. You have to get that agreement before you start the interview. And maybe get it through an email if you can. But I would also add, Brad, that you're right. We're in a different world now. And because the competitive nature has changed in the last 10 or 15 years, because of social media, because of the pressure to get it first, to get the story first, and to get it right, people are not necessarily honoring those agreements, right?
Sure. You see many cases of people not honoring those agreements. In fact, the Mr. Media Training blog is often made up of exactly those types of stories. And I just want to point out to people watching that it's not always nefarious. It's not reporters who are out to get you. Sometimes it is. But a lot of times it's just a misunderstanding. One of the things I hear and come across a lot is this idea that a spokesperson will say, okay, this is off the record, and they'll talk. About 30 seconds into talking, they finish the thought that they were on, and then they continue. The reporter reasonably concludes, okay, we're back on the record now. Exactly. Well, the spokesperson didn't see it that way. So it's not necessarily that reporters are out to get the person. A lot of times it's a misunderstanding, but that happens a lot too.
Yeah, and I've sat in with clients over the years, and I can actually, I'm visualizing those moments where we'll be sitting down with Cranes or the New York Times or Newsday, for instance, and something will come out. They'll say, oh, that was off the record. Too late, cat's out of the bag.
Yeah, right.
So I'm sure you've seen that too, and you're like, I'm like kicking them under the table. You didn't realize.
Yeah, if you're going to go off the record, one of the things we tell our clients is if you are going to, and there are rare times when it might make sense to do that. One of the things you have to look at is what is your relationship with the reporter. If this is somebody that's been covering your work for the past decade and has generally honored the agreements over time, that will be a safer bet. Not a guarantee, but a much safer bet than, let's say, a blogger who you're dealing with for the first time. I don't know the relationship that Barbara Morgan had with the reporter from Talking Points Memo. Perhaps they've known each other for some time, perhaps they haven't. But if she didn't analyze carefully what that relationship was, that was a mistake. And certainly based on the article that came out, I can't imagine they had a years-long, deep relationship. And as we talked about before the show began, her resume suggests that she hasn't spent a lot of time running campaigns before. So I don't know how deeply networked she was with the reporter who did that interview.
Yeah, good point. And I think I tweeted something about that today, about public officials. If you're, particularly public officials where you're under the microscope 24/7, you got to get the best people you can. And it's not not a time to try somebody out, not a time for interns, not a time for junior staffers, even if they're volunteering their time to work their way up the ladder. The risk is too great, and it points to, you and I talked offline a little bit, and we talked about Lizzie Grubman about a decade ago. People who, and that's why one of the reasons I was selfishly upset about this Barbara Morgan story, because when something like that happens, people not in our business of corporate communications and public relations and media training, they think that we all do that, or that we're all Lizzie Grubans, and it's just another shot at our industry, which we try very hard to maintain ethics and integrity. So.
Rich, I'm surprised. I run around using that language all the time. I don't know what you're talking about. No, I mean, you're right. It is from both sides, both the PR side and the politics side. Both of these are, public relations or communications, and politics used to be and should be honorable professions. And you're right. Every time an instance like this happens, both sides look worse. You see public approval ratings of probably, certainly in politics, I would imagine that public relations rank somewhere as low as Congress at this point. Yeah. And these instances are the reasons why. These people, as far as I'm concerned, who are willing to give an interview smearing, remember who this person was. This is a young intern. And maybe this intern did something she shouldn't have done. She probably did. Allegedly, at least, she broke a non-disclosure agreement. I'm not suggesting that she acted perfectly honorably here. Right. But there is, again, the artillery you need to use as a professional to respond to the allegations that she launched has to be commensurate in some way.
Right.
It is like trying to use a bulldozer to catch a squirrel. The language that she used is so vastly disproportionate. And one of the things I said that she should have done, I'm talking about Barbara Morgan, her spokesperson, in handling the intern, was to be calmly dismissive. I think the calmer her tone and the less credence she gave her accuser, the quicker the story would have gone away and the less credibility that this intern would have had. Paradoxically, the strength of her response made the intern story much more reasonable now than it might have otherwise been.
It legitimized it, yeah, and it gives it legitimacy. Absolutely, good point. Very, very interesting. One of the things that we'll wrap up in a minute or two. One of the things, Brad, that I found interesting, and this was a national story. I was watching the Sunday news programs, and they were talking about this, and and you were in the. I'm just curious because I was a little surprised how much time they devoted to this outside New York, if you will. On George Stephanopoulos, they did a piece on it. What do you think, as somebody who worked in Nightline? Why is this a story beyond New York? Or is it because it's New York, or it's because it's Anthony Weiner, the sexting scandal? I mean, from a journalistic standpoint, why did this go national, and why is it national now?
Well,
even before Barbara Morgan, yeah.
The fact that it's in New York is certainly a part of that. I mean, this is the media capital, certainly of the United States and maybe of the world. So you have all of the news trucks and all of the satellite trucks here. It is cheap. It is easy to get video on a compelling story very inexpensively. And, so that, and it has all of the salacious elements that journalists like to cover. It brings eyeballs to the screen. I am not, as a former journalist, going to defend the choice that the national press is going to make. Does this deserve the amount of press that it's receiving? Absolutely not.
Yeah, that was my reaction. I was just curious.
To your question about why. So I just want to say that from the start, I'm not justifying it.
Right.
But this is such an unusual scandal in a sea of tawdry sex scandals that have come before. As some other people have written before, using, for example, the analogy of, let's say, the Clinton scandal or the Elliot Weiner scandal.
Elliot Spitzer.
Elliot Spitzer. Is that what I said?
Yeah, it's Elliot Weiner. But I can understand why you'd say Elliot Weiner.
Oh, Elliot Weiner, yes. I can
Elliot Spitzer, yes. And I was going to ask you about that, but since you mentioned it, go ahead. Yeah.
So, as George W. Bush would say, subliminal moment.
Nuclear.
Exactly. This is, if you compare it, say, to a Clinton scandal, yes, it was tawdry, but ultimately that was a story. I'm talking about just the sexual part of it, not the...
We're talking about the Monica Lewinsky story.
But this was somebody who had an affair on his wife. Yes, in the Oval Office, and yes, he may have broken the law when he did it. But people understand affairs. Elliot Spitzer was with a prostitute. Maybe most people don't frequent prostitutes. But again, this was a story mostly about an affair. Yes, there was hypocrisy there, since Spitzer was also the self-appointed sheriff who was busting prostitution rings. But the general idea of somebody having an affair wasn't so mind-blowing to most people. This is a case where a guy who's in Congress is holding up a sign that says, "Yes, it's me," as he's sexting his shirtless photo to women he's never met before.
From the Capitol, by the way. From
Now
the
a
Capitol
total
gym, right?
a photo at the gym, a photo of him holding himself, naked photos. I think that, as opposed to physical affairs, which I think people can wrap their minds around easily, that is so far outside of the realm of what most people get in their personal lives. I think people understand things like phone sex and sending sexy tweets to people or sexy messages to people they know. I think sending random photos of your naked lower body to people you've never met before when you're in a position of power, you've been caught and want to run for the mayorship, is so outside of the realm of what most people can comprehend.
It's not somebody you'd want in charge of security for a city or a country, because we all know that you send something out there, it's for the entire world to see. And this is before we learned about the NSA snooping. I mean, the fact is, right? We know that.
In short, as opposed to many other sex scandals we've seen, this one just strikes many people as weird.
Okay.
And I think that, because it really doesn't fit the standard archetype of even the most tawdry sex scandals we've seen, that is bringing a focus to the story.
Interesting. And I wonder too, Brad, and I don't know if there's an answer, but because it's a mediocre field, if you will, of candidates, there's no Ed Koch type character or Rudy Giuliani, someone really who's dominating before they got in the race. Because it's a little bit mediocre, the media is looking for the reporters covering the campaign need to get some sexy stories, and this has just provided them with so much fodder for months now.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to feel bad for a couple of people. First of all, there's a candidate in the race, I think his name is John Liu, who's polling 6%, Weiner's at 16%. He used to be sitting in his office going, what do I have to do to be able to get on top of Weiner in the polls?
Right.
Well, on a more serious note, I can't tell you on a human level, his son, who is, I think, about a year old at this
That's
point,
exactly what I was thinking, yeah.
And you have to ask, why is this guy subjecting his family to that? His son will eventually have to go to school with other kids who have read about this story. I really have no comprehension. I cannot get into the mind of this man who knowing that he had continued to sext after he resigned, put himself back into a situation. I mean, so there really, in all of the humor and all of the spectacle, there really are people who are collateral damage here that make you wonder, what's driving this guy, and why won't he just get out?
Yeah, no, in fact, what you just said is something I put on my personal Facebook page, exactly what you said. As a father, that was what I mean, of course, you and I analyze these kind of stories every day, but on a personal level, I had a different thought, and exactly that, Brad. This poor kid is going to grow up, and, it could have stopped, when he got out of, Congress, and now to just, he's going to go to school, and it's going to be very difficult. More stories have come out since he got back in the race. A lot of that could have been kept under wraps if he just stayed in the private sector or done something else with his life. On a personal note, I don't get that, but we didn't get Elliot Spitzer either, or Saul Watler years ago. You may remember that too. Another situation that's similar. So. This will be an interesting one to watch, and for our viewers, please check out Brad's excellent post. And by the way, folks, Brad has a really huge following. It's always interesting to read the comments as well. A lot of people from inside our industry chime in as well to Brad's blog. It's a very interactive blog, and Brad's really good about getting back to people as well, even when people correct you on typos. You're such a good sport. You really are.
I appreciate that those nice words.
Yeah.
Thank you.
www.mrmediatraining.com. Brad's one of the best in the business. For those of you who want to tweet about what Brad and I are talking about, have talked about wherever you're watching this tonight or beyond on tape, please use the hashtag The Crisis Show or @The Crisis Show, and let us know your thoughts. Agree, disagree, whatever. We're open to that. Brad and I are very transparent people. As those of you who read our blogs and our Twitter feeds will know. And it's at Mr. Media Training on Twitter, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, good. Okay, so Brad, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Always great insights. I always learn something. And it also validates things that I may have been questioning myself. So it's always good to exchange these ideas and thoughts about these scandals. And hopefully, though, that those of you watching will learn something from this, whether you're a public official, president of a university, CEO. The rules are the same, right, Brad? I mean, no matter who you're talking about, we live in a 24/7 news cycle world now. Things happen very fast, and you have to be really careful about everything you say and do. So.
Yeah, the basic rules of the road are set. We have seen example after example of people who continue to make the same basic mistakes. In fact, one thing I almost feel in media training workshops when I tell people don't go off the record, with rare exceptions, but generally don't go off the record. If you're near a microphone, be very careful what you say. When I say those things, I almost feel like it's so redundant, and they know this, and they've heard this time and time again, and I'm boring them. And then something like this happens, which reminds you that even if these reminders feel basic, and maybe feel stale to us because we've said them so many times, that these are reminders that people clearly, or at least some people clearly, need to hear over and over again.
Absolutely. I call them wake-up calls and stock reminders every time this happens. So, and it does give us the opportunity to educate people, and that's the silver lining here. But this may be another show, a few weeks or a few months now. We'll see how this one plays out. This is breaking news, so it's always good to be able to talk about something that's literally happening. So we'll keep on top of it. Again, thank you so much, Brad. www.mrmediatraining.com. I'm Rich Klein, www.richkleincrisis.com. Brad, thanks so much for your time, and we'll talk soon. Have a great day.
Thank you to you and your viewers.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.